Thank you all. This is a wonderful crowd. I've got to say this is the best crowd I've ever seen at a book launch. So let's keep it going. This is also a pretty unusual book launch, as I'll describe very shortly. Again, I'd like to acknowledge our Coast Salish hosts and to thank them and the extended community for hospitality and ongoing support, especially on a night like this. It's really very heartening to see so many people showing so much enthusiasm and just bringing their presence here, especially on a rainy night. So thank you all very much. We really appreciate you being here, and we're really looking forward to a robust and provocative and thought-provoking conversation. So I would like to just share a little bit about the book for those who haven't yet read it, and then I'll introduce our speakers and we'll move on. This is a remarkable book. I just want to tell you what Tayage Alfred says about this book and its author. Glen Coulthard is a leading voice of the new indigenous intelligentsia, and he has accomplished so much with this book. And he's kind of ducking down right now. But these are words from Ty, so these are important to hear. To have rescued Karl Marx from his 19th century hostage chamber in that room in the British Library and to expose him to the full breadth of history and the light of the human landscape was enough to make this a great work of political theory. He's gone beyond that accomplishment in correcting Jean-Paul Sartre and Frantz Fanon's narrow vision, and brought Marx and Sartre and Fanon together with his Dene elders and me and you, reader and audience, to show us all how our psychoaffective attachments to colonialism are blocking the achievement of a just society. As such, this book is a profound critique of contemporary colonialism and a clear vision of indigenous resurgence and a serious contribution to the literature of freedom. So those are just the praising words in the preface, but incredibly accurate words as well. Glen is a scholar many people in this audience know personally, either through his teaching, through his scholarship, through his activism, or through his participation in all kinds of activities and communities throughout the Lower Mainland, throughout Canada, and internationally. I'm very proud to be his colleague in the First Nation Studies program. Glen and our other faculty and our students and our staff have built a really exciting program. I'm a little partial, but without the intellectual rigor, without the compassionate heart, and without the profound ethical concern, our program wouldn't be nearly as strong as it is, and I think our conversations in the field wouldn't be nearly as strong as they are. So just a little summary about the book. This book is about a lot of things, but one of the main things it is a critique of the politics of recognition and the idea that if the Canadian nation state just recognizes Indigenous rights, then that is a solution to colonialism. And the book pulls that apart and looks at the very foundation of that idea of recognition being posited on the idea of Indigenous dispossession and the disconnection of Indigenous people from the land and from self-determination. And he does this through a number of analyses of Marx, of Fanon, of the gendered functions of colonialism, of land claims, and then he ends with something that I think offers us some things to think about. 5 theses on Indigenous resurgence and decolonization. The first one being on the necessity of direct action, capitalism no more, dispossession and Indigenous sovereignty in the city, so looking at urban indigeneity, gender justice and decolonization, and thinking beyond the nation state. So it's a provocation. It is a book that asks us to think in very challenging ways, asks us to think about ourselves and our own implications in these processes, but also visions a different way forward and different kinds of conversations for the future. So in thinking about tonight, it would one thing we wanted to make very clear is that this is not the beatification of Saint Glen. It is because he is one of the leading indigenous political theorists working today. He is a man who is very used to engaging and grappling with really complex, controversial issues. And our panelists this evening are here to help grapple with that as well. And part of a respectful and enriching dialogue is one where disagreement and challenge are part of the possibility, as well as praise, Glen. Because there is much to praise. I told Glen, I've been working with him for 2.5 years now, and I've read his work and I've taught his work. This is the first time in preparation for this that I was able to read the full book, and it was a remarkable experience. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. But I also know that it is part of a really significant conversation, and there are a lot of debates that go in that. So tonight, Glen will be here to listen to 4 really remarkable thinkers engage, challenge, grapple with, and expand on his ideas, and then open it up to some larger conversations. So we're delighted that you're here. We're really grateful for your participation, and we look forward to seeing not just where this conversation goes tonight, but where these conversations can take us in the days to come throughout this land, throughout this country, and throughout this world. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker this evening is Rita Damun. She's an assistant professor in political science at the University of Victoria, the territory of the Lekwungen peoples in Canada. Yeah, that's kind of implied we're here. Her research interests broadly focus, I should have read through this a little bit more carefully as I was going through. Her research interests broadly focus on the politics of difference, including multiculturalism and nation building, secularization and race, settler colonialism, gender and feminist politics, intersectionality, critical race and anti-colonial politics, relationships between people of color and indigenous peoples, and Sikhs and the problem with inclusion. Among other publications, she is the author of Identity/Difference Politics, Considerations on Mainstreaming Intersectionality, and Feminisms. Her work is rooted in anti-racist feminist action, and we're very happy that she will be leading us off this evening. I will introduce everybody, and then we'll have them all come up at once. So Rita is our first. Our second speaker is Matt Hearn. His articles and books have been published on all 6 continents and translated into 10 languages. He teaches at a variety of universities, lectures globally, and continues to organize in East Vancouver, Coast Salish territories, where he lives with his partner, daughters, cats, and chickens. Our third speaker is Jarrett Martineau, a Cree Dene digital media producer, hip-hop artist, and academic from Frog Lake First Nation in Alberta. He's a PhD candidate in Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria. Jarrett has worked at the intersection of art, media, and activism for many years, and his research examines the role of art and creativity in advancing Indigenous nationhood and decolonization. He is the co-founder and creative producer of Revolutions Per Minute, a new music platform to promote Indigenous music culture, and an organizer with the Indigenous nationhood movement. And our final panelist is Sarah Hunt, a writer, educator, and activist currently based in Lekwungen territories in Victoria, and is of Kwakwaka'wakw, Ukrainian, and English ancestry. She has more than 15 years' experience doing community-based work on issues of justice, education, and cultural revitalization in rural and urban Indigenous communities across BC. Most recently, Sarah's research investigated the relationship between law and violence in ongoing neo-colonial relations in BC, asking how violence gains visibility through Indigenous and Canadian socio-legal discourse and action. Her research is particularly concerned with revitalizing Indigenous law and Indigenous territorial relations through local-level anti-violence initiatives. So if you could please help me welcome our 4 panelists to the stage. Now, I need just a little clarification. Are you going to come up here now? Or okay. So let me also introduce the man of the hour. And I have so many things I want to tease him about, but we won't. But he's good for it. Glen Coulthard is an assistant professor in the First Nations Studies program and the Department of Political Science. Glen has written and published numerous articles and chapters in the areas of contemporary political theory, indigenous thought and politics, and radical social and political thought. He is Yellowknives Dene. He is a consummate scholar. He is an excellent colleague, and probably the best thing I can say about him is that he is a good human being. Please help me welcome Glen Coulthard. So Glen will talk at the end, after everyone else has had the opportunity to engage his ideas. So we will begin. So the idea is every one of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes. Glen will have his opportunity to respond at the end. We'll open it up to a short period of question and answer, and then we will go from there into the reception and the book launch and so on and so forth. So let's... and when it comes to discussion time, I'm going to be coming up every once in a while just to check on time. So, Rita, would you like to begin?
Oh, can I use that?
I'll wave frantically. Oh, thank you.
Okay. It'll become clear why I need to stand towards the end. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. I'm going to say thanks to Am as well, one of the key organizers, for the lovely introduction. About 5 minutes ago, Glen said to me, as soon as he invited me, he regretted it. So I'm honored to be part of this event, not only because to celebrate this book and because Glen has shaped my work quite profoundly over the past 10 years, and I'm very grateful to him for that, but also honored to be on this panel with these amazing people. It just seems so striking to me who we have here today. This book is part of an emerging body of work by Indigenous scholars who are rooted in collective organizing. These scholars are dismantling the Master's House, but as Leanne Simpson notes, they are also rebuilding their own Indigenous homes and ways of being. In this lies the transformative possibilities of Coulthard's book. Now, we often acknowledge the land and the territory we're on the West Coast at social justice events, but we need to be clear why we do this. Today, I acknowledge the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Solitude, and land is a site of struggle, and as Coulthard reminds us, it's also a site of resurgence. As we speak today, there is a Tolton blockade led by Indigenous women against imperial metals at the site of the Mount Polly spill. Protesters continue to do blockades at Highway 6 between Caledonia and Haggersville to demand action on the murdered and missing Aboriginal girls and women. The Mi'kmaq warriors have been organizing against big oil and fracking. The Yenka Dene Alliance have initiated the Hold the Wall campaign in their opposition to Enbridge Northern Pipeline. The Uniston camp is defending their territories against incursions by governments and industry. This is the context in which this book has emerged, in the context of Indigenous resurgences that are already happening. And I want to note that these resurgences are happening. I see Coulthard's book as one dimension of his work on resurgence, where the book is part of a broader project of his in the Bush School of Deshenta, where hunting, fishing, and wild harvesting are integrated into the curriculum with Indigenous political theory, his work on social media as a site of political organizing, his work on the ground here with local Indigenous communities as a Dene man from another territory. This is important to note, for a book never represents the entirety of a body of work for the scholar. And in the case of Glen, his way of being in the world is clearly rooted at the level of different communities. So I have three things I want to say about the book. The first is how the political theory is rooted in political struggle. The second is, he won't be surprised by this, gendering and queering redskins, white masks. And the third is why this book matters to non-Indigenous people. So those will be the three things. And then, just to make him really uncomfortable, my conclusion is a poem. Right, so the first thing around how this book, the key ideas in this book are rooted in political practice and political struggle. He draws on the work of Marx, Fanon, and those scholars in particular I think are important because they too were rooted in political struggles of their time around class and capitalism, around colonialism. What we can take away from some of these key ideas, and I'll just run through some of the key ones, is firstly the notion of primitive accumulation. Coulthard reminds us and shows us in different ways that primitive accumulation is a process of dispossession through which non-capitalist social relations are transformed or integrated into market ones. Here, the privatization of land and accumulation of capital is colonial in nature and most importantly ongoing in land dispossession. Now, it would be interesting to engage in some feminist critiques of primitive accumulation, and Glen certainly points to some of these. But the thing that really he emphasizes here is that the privatization of land and accumulation of capital is fundamentally colonial. So that's one, primitive accumulation. He also gives us an alternative vision of indigenous anti-capitalism. There is no good or bad version of capitalism that you can really work with, is what he's saying. In this, he develops the notion of grounded normativity. Grounded normativity is deeply informed by what the land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about living our lives in relationship to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitative terms. Here, man is not above nature, but we need to be ecologically attentive, and state violence is not just in terms of brute violence, but in terms of recognition and reconciliation. A further key concept is colonial recognition, and here Coulthard is really pointing out the structural problems at the level of the individual and the collective psychology of subjects of empire. So this connection between the structure and the psychic dimensions of colonialism are really important, and he draws on Fanon to do this. He offers us a careful study of state legal and political recognition, which has been used to depoliticize and domesticate. This includes how cultural recognition has been reframed by the states and courts negatively, in the case of his own people, the Dene, who have challenged extractive capitalism. He also looks at the constitutional debates about cultural rights versus sexual equality rights, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Residential School Apology, recently signed treaties in BC, and the TRC, all of which he says are tools of state recognition to make colonialism an issue of the past that Indigenous people are supposed to just get over. In all of these ways, he shows that it is that state is framing the problem as one in which Indigenous people need to be repaired, and it's not the colonial relationship that needs to be repaired. He further draws on the work of Nietzsche, Sartre, Fanon to think through the language of political anger and righteous resentment. And we've certainly had some lively conversations around righteous resentment in very embodied ways. Under certain conditions, Coulthard says, righteous resentment is helpful for prompting self-affirmative and decolonizing praxis, and can importantly help undo internalized colonialism. Righteous resentment is an important emotional reminder that settler colonialism is still very much alive and well in Canada. So here he offers us the notion of turning away from the state and the master in order to purge internal colonialism. So this is another key idea, that there is an alternate form of recognition that's available to us, one that's not involved in the colonizer's form, which is very interesting, I think, that he still wants to use the language of colonialism, he still wants to use the language of recognition, but a non-colonial form of recognition. And the final key idea that he's drawing on theoretically that's rooted in political struggle is the notion of turning inward, where resurgent practices of individual and collective cultural self-recognition are permanent and not transitional. So those are some of the key ideas, I think, that I took away from the book in terms of the relationship between theoretical ideas and political struggle. The second is the underlying commitment to gendering Redskins' white mask that's clearly there in the book. And here, I think Glen really relies on Fanon in some ways, and Fanon often gets dismissed as not being feminist enough, but I think Fanon offers us very important insights about the anguish on race and sexuality, and how that can disclose male and female colonial desire in different ways. Coulthard, I do think, nonetheless departs from Fanon's understanding of women's agency, because he really emphasizes patriarchal colonialism in his book. He dedicates a chapter specifically to colonial recognition that Indigenous women have navigated in law and constitutional politics. He draws on the work of Doreen Nason and Leanne Simpson in his 5 theses of Indigenous resurgence and decolonization, specifically to foreground gender justice. But sometimes he weaves between saying decolonization and resurgence as dispossession is intrinsic to, that dispossession as a form of capitalism is a metastructure in which gender considerations arise from this issue of dispossession. So another way to say that is to say that we can explain violence against Indigenous women by looking at primitive accumulation. And then other times he says that gender justice is intrinsic to decolonization, so that the two are inseparable. So I think that that's an important move that he's trying to make here, because it allows him to criticize feminist organizations who turn to the masculinist state for recognition, as was the case during the constitutional debates in Canada in the 80s and 90s, and the tension that the state manufactured between cultural rights and sex equality rights. And I think the state is very good at manufacturing this. We can see this in the way that Muslim women also get treated. But some questions. Is turning away a privilege that is differently accorded to non-cis men? How are the psyches of Indigenous women, girls, non-gender conforming peoples differently shaped by colonialism? How does the separation of production and reproduction, the patriarchy of wage, inform dispossession? In what ways was the nuclear family strengthening dispossession? How are women's bodies used as a form of alienated labor under capitalism? How are heterosexual desires formations of primitive accumulation in the sexual economy? Is the making of modern sexuality a consequence of primitive accumulation or a driving force? Another way to say this is, how might we think about the interchange between resentment and love, anger and care, through a feminist and queer reading of Red Skins, White Masks? So that's my second point. And I think that the work is there, and these questions are just to kind of push him further. The third final point I want to make is that this book, I think the main audience of this book, at least, is primarily for Glen, as my understanding, is that the primary audience is Indigenous peoples as well as political theorists. But I think this book can also be read as a call to non-Indigenous peoples, whether we're people of color, environmentalists, anti-racists, members of the LGBTQ communities, however you self-identify, that it can be read as a call to non-Indigenous peoples to mobilize. Because the issues about dispossession and recognition are not just about the responsibility of Indigenous peoples. If we care about racism, migration, Islamophobia, the bear trophy hunt, racial profiling against blacks, refugee laws, the temporary foreign workers, sanctuary cases, Palestinian struggles, LGBT queer, trans issues, climate change, oil spills, the damage done to our oceans and our rivers, the deaths in Syria, you know, the US drones in Pakistan, yeah. If we care about any of these issues, and it might just be one of them, we have to care and collectively organize against dispossession. This isn't just because we materially benefit from living on these lands known as Canada, or because our struggles, but because our struggles are interlinked with that of others. This is how white supremacy, capitalist, ableist patriarchy works. These are the connections. So I think this book needs to be read within the context of larger critiques against the forces of conservatism and neoliberalism and securitization, because we are in the shift to the right in Canada. This is evident in our immigration policies, the attack on unions, the changes in environmental regulations, Canada's support of the Israeli state. So when Coulthard is referencing his 5 theses, which Daniel referenced, we as non-Indigenous peoples must ask ourselves, what are our obligations to these calls? How might we support direct action as subjects of empire in the case of non-white peoples? How might we challenge and engage in anti-capitalist transformation in the political economy of contemporary settler colonialism, which might require non-Indigenous people to examine how we become invested in corporate models of extraction and farming, in private property, and the model minority? How might we refuse the segregation between urban spaces from native space and the gentrification of urban spaces? How might we challenge the misogyny of settler colonialism and the centrality of the violence against Indigenous women and other non-conforming gender subjects? How might we be open to the possibility of rejecting the nation state as a site of political change? Seems like a lot to demand. But I want to reiterate that this is already happening. This is happening across British Columbia, across Canada, as well as other parts of the world. So, as a way of concluding, as I said, I've written a poem for Glen. I've only written 2 poems. This is the second one. The first was, yeah, I know. That's why I needed to stand up. I needed to feel like I could do this. And I'm quite nervous about the poem. The first poem was dedicated to my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was hung by the British. And I was inspired to write a poem after going to India with my mum and my musti. So this poem is an ode to Redskin's White Mask. It's using a very famous line in Fanon's book, Blackskin White Mask, a line in which a boy, I think it's a boy, identifies the moment of colonial recognition. And the quote is, from Fanon, "Look, a Negro. Mama, see the Negro, I'm frightened." So I've tentatively titled this poem, "Look, a tall Dene man. Mama, see the tall Dene man, I'm frightened." You should be. So that's the title. Here's the poem. When Harper says Canada has no history of colonialism, how can you not be angry? When Tina Fontaine went missing in foster care and her body was pulled out of the Red River, how can you not be angry? As omnibus budget bills deny Indigenous sovereignty, oil sands, fracking, pipelines destroy land, animals, rivers, and cause cancer, when gentrification causes urban displacement, poverty, homelessness, how can you not be angry? Why isn't everyone angry? Why isn't everyone enraged and yelling no to recognition? Their colonial politics of recognition is empty, hollow, imbued with white masculinity, committed to extraction, exploitation, misogyny. It is brute violence. Look, a tall Dene man. Mama, see the tall Dene man turning away from the white masks. Your anger and resentment orients your political and moral protest against the theft of land, against settler colonialism, against the damage to the psyches of generations, against the apology, the TRC, Canadian law, and against the domestication of the Dene, your people. Your people. Your righteous resentment grounds your normativity for, not against land. Land as reciprocal relations, land as obligation, land as identity, as relationship, as material survival. Look, a tall Dene man. Mama, see the tall Dene man ripping apart the white masks. You shout, direct action against empire, anti-capitalism, native space and land, decolonial gender justice, transcend the nation state. Look, a tall Dene man. Mama, see the tall Dene man standing among his people. And so, hold closely the love that arises with your anger. Remember the gifts of the women and your children. As you shed the white mask, reveal the beauty of your red power. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Rita. I gotta follow that, huh? Shit. I got no poems. I'm sorry. I too would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh, and to express gratitude for their generosity and hospitality. I'd also like to express gratitude to fellow panelists and to Daniel. Say thanks a lot for being here, and I'm honored to sit with you. And thanks to Am and to Andrea and to Fiorella for organizing it as usual so well and pulling out a lovely crowd tonight. And I guess maybe more than thanks, Glen. Glen, thanks for all of it, and I'm flattered that you asked me to sit here. So thanks very much. I got 3 sets of comments that I want to make. The first one is, maybe it's a bit obvious, but if you haven't read this book, and it's come out pretty recently, do. Really do. They're for sale in the lobby. They're $20. They're available. I would really highly recommend it. And in some ways, for many of us, and for me for sure, it's easy sometimes to get intimidated by Glen's erudition and multisyllabic words sometimes. But honestly, it's a tremendous book, and you're going to hear that frequently tonight. But it's really true. And reading the book will take some effort, and it's really entirely worth it. I've listened to Glen and talked to him and read a ton, I think probably almost everything he's written for the last number of years. And I think that this book actually really builds on a lot of his previous work. So if you're familiar with him, I really recommend you to pick this up, because for me, I gained a whole lot of new insight, not just into his work, but into a whole range of stuff that I think he pulls together beautifully. And I think that one of the best things about the book is the way it unfolds. I was telling Glen this earlier tonight, but several times during the course of the book, I had questions and critiques, and I furiously wrote some stuff down, and then immediately within a page or two, he'd answered me. And I was like, oh, okay, I got to get rid of that thing, you know. And it was fantastic. The book unfolds itself really, really beautifully. And I think that it makes both a whole series of singly important, but in toto, a very profound set of arguments. And I would say maybe I mean what Tyagi says is true in lots of ways, and it's a tremendous compliment, as Daniel read already. He said that this book makes a serious contribution to the literature of freedom, and that's a tremendous compliment, and it is totally warranted. That I would say that maybe at the outset anyways, one of his core insights is a reframing of Hegelian master-slave formulations, and he brings Fanon to bear in a really kind of interesting and compelling ways. A new kind of, I would say, stretching of Marxist theory, perhaps post-Marxist theory, so that the subjective-objective and the cultural and the materialist forms of resistance to settler colonialism are not antagonistic, but Glen brings them together to wage what Fanon calls waging a war on two fronts, and it's a really important idea in lots of ways, and in part because Glen really, I would say, carefully and articulately highlights the importance of struggle, and that may sound obvious in lots of ways. But he highlights what he calls the centrality of self-affirmation and self-transformation for colonized and oppressed people everywhere. And that's the key lever point for me, the key pivot point for starting to think about his critique of the politics of recognition, and why the political kind of Tayloristic renditions of recognition are so inadequate for the task at hand, and sometimes even in their most subtle renditions. I want to read you just one little part here. This is from the end of chapter 1. Fanon suggests that Hegel provided a partial answer, that those struggling against colonialism must turn away from the colonial state and society, and instead find their own decolonial praxis, the source of their liberation. Today, this process will and must continue to involve some form of critical, individual, and collective self-recognition on the part of indigenous societies, not only in an instrumental sense like Fanon seemed to have envisioned it, but with the understanding that our cultural practices have much to offer regarding the establishment of relationships within and between peoples and the natural world built on principles of reciprocity and respectful coexistence. Also, the empowerment that is derived from this critically self-affirmative and self-transformative ethics of desubjectification must be cautiously directed away from the assimilative lure of the statist politics of recognition, and instead be fashioned towards our own on-the-ground struggles of freedom. As the feminist anti-racist theorist Bell Hooks explains, such a project would minimally require that we stop being so preoccupied with looking to quote-unquote to that other for recognition. Instead, we should be recognizing ourselves and then seeking to make contact with all who engage us in a constructive manner. I think that's a really important and valuable insight for lots of ways. And there's a number of other threads that I think that I'm interested in pulling on from my own work. But there's just one here that I want to highlight for you. And I've been writing and thinking a lot lately about property, about ownership, about land, and about sovereignty in all its senses. First is routes to try to grapple with urban gentrification and displacement, but more generally to try to understand settler colonial and capitalist processes of dispossession. And right now, I mean specifically right now, I'm interested in exactly how accumulation by dispossession actually works. We can see it and we understand it at some levels, but I'm interested in the actual mechanisms by which accumulation, by which dispossession is turned into accumulation in particular kinds of ways, and how we've normalized our ideas of enclosure, the idea of turning land into property, and exactly how we have allowed profit to be pulled from the Commonwealth, specifically from the land. So I've been working for a while here to try to trace and think against what are essentially Lockean notions of profit and sovereignty. And it's really hard sometimes. It's really hard for me, I suspect for most of us, to think outside the normative discursive limitations that I have set upon myself and assumed so much. And it's really complicated to try to think outside yourself. And it's here, I would say, that Glen and Glen's book particularly here have helped me significantly. And as Rita and maybe perhaps some other panelists and maybe some of you will note particularly, there's a part in a chapter, in the second chapter, where he builds on the late Vine Deloria, among many others, to develop this idea of grounded normativity. So that's my first kind of question. Sometime maybe in your remarks you can tease out some of your ideas about grounded normativity and where it came from. But I want to read just another little part here, too, that I found particularly powerful. This is from chapter 2 here. He says, in his groundbreaking 1972 text, God is Red, the late Lakota philosopher Vine Deloria Jr. argues that one of the most significant differences that exist between indigenous and Western metaphysics revolves around the central importance of land to indigenous modes of being, thought, and ethics. When, quote-unquote, ideology is divided according to American Indian and Western European traditions, writes Deloria, this fundamental difference is of great philosophical importance. American Indians hold their lands, places, as having the highest possible meaning, and all their statements are made with this reference point in mind. Most Western societies, by contrast, tend to derive meaning from the world in historical developmental terms, thereby placing time as the narrative of central importance. Deloria then goes on to conclude, quote, when one group is concerned with the philosophical problem of space and the other with the philosophical problem of time, then the statements of either group do not make much sense when transferred from one context to the other without the proper consideration of what is taking place. Now I want just to add just a little bit here from Glen particularly. It says, seen in this light, it's a profound misunderstanding to think of land or place as simply some material object of profound importance to indigenous cultures, although it is this too. Instead, it ought to be understood as a relationships of things to each other. Place is a way of knowing, of experiencing, and relating to the world and others. And sometimes these relational practices and forms of knowledge guide forms of resistance against other rationalizations of the world that threaten to erase or destroy our senses of place. This, I argue, is precisely the understanding of land that grounded our critique of colonialism and capitalism in the 70s and early 80s. I think that's a really important insight and something that really ran home with me in a lot of ways. And I think for a number of reasons. In part because it opens up a whole bunch of really important, really valuable epistemological and ontological space. It gives us a whole different set of frames and it allowed me to think in a different set of ways about constructions like development and progress. And I would say that Glen offers a really compelling post-development, decolonized set of possibilities. And that's my second set of questions for you. If you can talk about notions of development that you implied but don't address directly in the book. I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about post-development or to talk about what those frames that you were using. And I had the great good fortune over the last decade or so to spend a bunch of time in Denver, specifically in the Satu. And after reading Glen's history of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline in Chapter 3, or maybe Chapter 2, I realized how much I have to rethink there and relearn. But just how clearly this account and Glen's work in general has allowed me to rethink and re-understand not just the theory, but my everyday experiences in the North. And that, I'd say, is a great complement of any kind of presumptively theoretical work, is it allows us to rethink the everyday in a really kind of interesting and valuable ways. So my last set of comments then are a little different, I guess, which are that I actually want to praise the book a lot, and I think that's great that we've all come out to talk about the book and what an accomplishment it is. But I actually want to praise Glen a little bit here. Not as an author, but as a father, a son, a partner, a friend, and an activist. And I know that this is kind of the kind of shit that he will totally embarrass him, but he's stuck. So tough it out, bubs. So I just want to say that through good times and hard times, and as long as I've known Glen, I've admired so much about him personally and about how he moves in the world. And I feel like I'm going to speak for a lot of us here tonight on that count. In many ways, Glen acts exactly like I think an academic, a public intellectual, an activist, and a writer should act. He shows up over and over again for all kinds of events, big and small, for celebrations and ceremonies, and for all kinds of causes, despite having a heavy schedule. He is not ensconced in his office. He's in the world working as hard as anyone should work, consistently speaking radically, clearly, and profoundly. But more than that, and he does it all, and I think we've all experienced this in a lot of ways. He does that with such a clear commitment to his family, to his friends, and his community, and with such consistent integrity, grace, and force. So, really, Glen is just a great guy. He's a fantastic guy. Yeah, and he's someone I, like so many of us here, I look to very often personally for personal inspiration, and somebody who I strive often to emulate. And I just so thanks, man, and much respect and congratulations on this, my friend.
All right. Tanse, good evening, everybody. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples and the place where we are tonight, and give my deep thanks for the invitation to be able to be here and speak with all of you tonight. First of all, I just want to make a couple of observations about the work that Glen is doing. The first one is the fact that he's the only academic I know right now who is getting people across social media to post photos, selfies of themselves with hashtag RSWM. Photos of themselves saying, "I can't believe I just got a copy of this book." I don't know how many people contacted me saying, "Do you know where I can get a copy? I went to the bookstore every day this week trying to see if it was in stock yet." He's already sold out of the first run of the book from the publisher in the span of 3 weeks, thousands of copies. And I say all that, and all of you guys that are here today, there's a live stream going on. I don't know if people are blogging this event. The point is, this is not exactly commonplace in academic circles or among academic work. But there's a few things about that I think are really, really wonderful and are really, really make me happy and really proud both to be here tonight, but also for the work that Glen's doing. The first of which is the fact that all of you are here. People are interested in this work. People are interested in these ideas. This is relevant to people. It's resonating with people. How many people have read the book? Just by show of hands. How many people are going to buy the book tonight, by the way? Yeah, exactly. My point is that in doing the work of decolonization and resurgence, in working from within an Indigenous perspective in places like the Academy, in working in sites where we're constantly trying to work out the mechanics and the details of how it is that we can do work that actually reaches our own people, that reaches across communities to build solidarity and alliances, and fundamentally that does work that connects us to the struggle that we're already embedded in and have been embedded in for so long, a struggle that's continuous, doing work that solicits that interest, solicits that participation, that begins those conversations or continues those conversations, and most importantly, and I think this is what this book is really about, calls us to action, calls us to attention, calls us to a critical engagement with how we are in the world, the way that we see ourselves in that world, and how we want to move our movement forward. That is a really, really profound thing to be doing and a really important intervention to make in the discipline in which Glen works, and more broadly in terms of the literature and the thinking, and hopefully then the action that results from that literature and from that thinking. There's often a tension, at least I find in my experience in academia, that people are very ambivalent about being in those spaces, ambivalent about using the academy, the knowledge that's produced there, as a site from which to think about how we can mobilize our people into action. But I think Glen's work really shows that once we can get through a lot of detailed concepts and what for a lot of people is difficult jargon, that underlying that there's a really substantial, a really deep level, and a really thoughtful analysis that's grounded in who he is, that's grounded in a day understanding of the world, that uses Marx and Fanon and Hegel and Taylor and all these people that he's using not to valorize them, but to say what relevance do they have to the work that we're doing? How does this inform the way that we see the world? And how can we take that and mobilize it for our own purposes? And so fundamentally what I think this book does and why I think it's important is it's an act of transformation. So it's an intervention into discourse, but it's seeking an act that itself is creative. And that creative act is about transformation. He does a really great job through the book of analyzing this at multiple levels. Matt pulled out the quote, but let me just see where it is here. The war on two fronts. Arguably, the front line is everywhere right now, especially it feels that way. But the two fronts in particular that he talks about, and this is from Fanon and from others, but that he does, I think, some interesting work with, is this question of the subjective, the individual, the self, and the collective. And those are sort of in dialogue together with this other front, which is the structural, the systemic, and the way that impacts in a really material way. And so in order to understand those two things together, you have to understand that you can't do transformation in one without doing transformation at the other and expect to get the results that we want. If we only talk about this in strictly economic and materialist terms and not that at the level of this psychoaffective conditioning, this deeply internalized forms of colonialism, we don't get to make those other forms of transformation and vice versa. And this tension that's constantly being held is one that I think he really does a great job of unpacking, but also one that is a really, really important consideration for all of us in trying to do this work. It's too easy often to get lost in these kind of silos, and when we think about the work as one or the other, and not think about how not only does that transformation have to be effected contemporaneously, simultaneously at both levels, but always with this critical, conscious, intentional focus on what it is that we're trying to challenge and trying to transform. He talks about it in this way. This is from page 49. He says, really this work is about critically reevaluating, reconstructing, and redeploying indigenous cultural forms in ways that seek to prefigure alongside those with similar ethical commitments. So other communities, other alliances that we know we need given the size of our population and the scale of the struggle, in order to make radical alternatives to the structural and psychoaffective facets of colonial domination. And he has this terribly catchy phrase that I'm going to repeat to you. I think Matt might have mentioned this one too. Critically self-affirmative and self-transformative ethics of desubjectification. We've all been there. We've all been there. For sure, bro, for sure. You want me to tell you what that means? Okay. Here's my little crack at trying to unpack a little bit about this, because I think my own process of trying to understand what it is that Glen is asking and what it is that he's asking us to consider is, I think, a big part of this work. Because in my own engagement with these questions at the level of community organizing, at the level of reading and academic thinking and various other places that I bore people to death trying to talk about these issues, I really think that the process is important. And I think that the process really does determine what the outcomes are going to be. And this is what the essence of what he's talking about with prefiguration. We need to embody, inhabit, and enact the very things that we're trying to bring about in the processes and in the ways that we do it. And he's reminding us of that in order to make this critically self-affirmative and self-transformative ethics of desubjectification, we got to get like an acronym or something for that, like a good long acronym. In order to do that work, That needs to be from within our own systems and knowledges, within our own cultural practices, within our own ways of understanding who we are and how we are in the world. And so self-recognition is in part a critique of the way that we've been seeking value from other places that don't belong to us, that don't have our best interests in mind, that in effect are actually trying to subjugate us and have been for a very, very long time. And if we continue to seek value in a place that is not valuing us, again, we're not going to get the results that we're seeking. And if this project is about transforming ourselves, transforming that society, not only being subjected to power, but desubjectivizing ourselves in order to reemerge in a different way, that creative transformation has to be rooted in what he's calling grounded normativity, but which is really our own ways of understanding how we live in place, how we have ethics in relationship to that place, how we have knowledge that's derived from that place, how that knowledge is intimately connected to the land, things that Native people have been saying for a long time. So in a lot of ways, I think Glen's intervention is also not necessarily new. It's not like he's saying something that's radically, not been thought before. He's reaffirming that the fact that the work that we've been doing, the resistance we've been doing, the resurgence that we're advocating for is about a continuation. It's about a continuum. It's about reestablishing ourselves in a place of power and strength and with agency, with the possibility of making these kind of changes that he's talking about. And the other piece then, of course, that I want to talk a little bit about in relationship to that is this idea of ressentiment, righteous anger. What do we do with this anger? And as Rita so eloquently put it in her opening remarks and her poem, we have every reason to be angry. And I worry, and this is just my little personal aside for where we are in the moment, but I worry about us being in a time where there's not a lot of space left for that, and where the trope of the angry Indian is a real hindrance to us being able to express what I think Glen really reasserts for us is a really important part of what our experience is, that it's actually an appropriate response to colonial injustice to be angry about it. It's not just anger for its own sake. It's not just resentment with no possibility of transforming it. It's a creative response and an emotional response to the ongoing subjugation of our people, the ongoing forces of dispossession that haven't gone away, the colonialism that is structural and embedded in our lives, not the event that happened a long time ago, right? So what we do with that energy, where we put it, is of course really important. Glen in his book really directs us to focus on structural transformation. So really to take that energy and channel it so it can become the foundation for these self-affirming forms of bringing ourselves into new forms of subjectivity, right? So rooted in cultural practice, rooted in ceremony, rooted in all these things that are from within our own understandings and within our own nations, which is an affirmation of indigenous nationhood, right? But there's a real problem, or at least the potential for a problem, I'll put it this way. And this is, I know, a critique that Glen has heard, but I'm going to raise it again tonight because I don't actually feel like he fully addressed it in the book in the way that I'd hope. So this is a question to you, is about this potential for anger to go sideways. This potential for us not always to be effectively conscious, critically engaged in all these ways about where that righteous resentment goes. For the righteousness maybe to slip a little bit away and for it just to be that resentment. I've been at a lot of gatherings where we have a lot of our people there, and when we open it up for Q&A, there's often a lot of people that just need to get out, just need to share a story about how angry they are, how upset they are. Because we don't have a lot of spaces in our communities and in society in general for that to be expressed. And so I think what Glen is calling for is really important because we need to find a way to deal with it because it's not going away, it's deepening, and it can be an important part of this transformation that he's advocating for and that I've been talking about over and over again tonight. But I think finding these healthy ways of expressing it, I don't even know if healthy is the right word. I think finding ways of us taking that and doing something with it, having it not be something that can be re-internalized and fall back in on us in a way that hinders us is a really, really important point, and one that I hope we can talk to a little bit more. I'm not going to go on for too much longer. I guess maybe the last thing that I'll say, and this is following a little bit from Glen's final chapter where he offers these theses and reflects a little bit on the I Don't Know More movement. I'm really happy to have Glen's book come out at the time that it's come out, even with a little bit of a window outside of the frenzy of I Don't Know More, because I feel like we need more reflection on all that mobilization and energy and activism and organizing and everything that happened a couple of winters ago. We're coming up on the second anniversary now, if you want to call it that, or at least 2 winters away from when all this kind of started up again. But it's gone in many different directions, as you guys probably know and have been following. And he refers to a few of those as parts of the kind of continuum of the organizing and activism. Places like El Sabuktuk with the resistance to the Mi'kmaq, and a lot of the organizing and activism that's happened around missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I think if you look at one of the places where there's been a lot of challenges about where to put anger and where to put righteous resentment, I think that's really one of the important places that we can see that it's being put in order to do something with it and in order to transform it into something that is healing and restorative and regenerative. And so ultimately, I guess I just want to commend Glen for pointing us to those things that can be the source of our liberation if we are able to think about them in that way. And that any work that challenges us to do that critical self-examination about where we're putting our time, what it is that we're prioritizing, and where we're putting our energy, and to try to think really critically about that. Because we know this work needs to be done. We hope that we can do it in a way that's going to help all of us move forward in a better way together. But if we just accept the terms that are given to us, we're not going to get where we want to go. And I think Glen's book is a really important step in us helping to figure out how to do that. So, Masi Cho, brother.
Should have organized it by height so that it could just go. So Gila Kasla. My name is Sarah Hunt, and I'm Kwagil from the Kwakwaka'wakw people from Tsahis, and want to also acknowledge the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people on whose territories we're gathered here today. I also want to thank Glen for inviting me to speak today, and to everyone who organized this event, and to all of you for being here today. So today, I'm gonna read mostly, just so that I have my thought. There's a lot to say about an entire book, so just wanted to keep my thoughts somewhat organized. So today is a day of celebration. No, we're not here to celebrate a new relationship between Natives and Canada, nor an end to colonial oppression. We're here instead to celebrate the renewed vision, the clarified account of what colonial relations actually look like in Canada today, as described by Glen Coulthard's critically engaged theorizing in this incredible book. Redskin White Mass has brought us together here today on these unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples to celebrate the vision of resurgence Glen so beautifully shares with us, and that you've already heard quite a bit about today. In my Kwakwaka'wakw teachings, such celebrations are time when we feast, display our rights, honor our networks of relations, and tell our stories through song, dance, and orality, while surrounded by witnesses, who then become accountable to that which they witness. As such, I want to approach this book as I would approach our stories, our ceremonies, asking what these stories teach us about who we are, where we are, and how we might envision our future as Indigenous peoples. The story in this book is one of self-affirmation, as you've been hearing, of survival and ongoing resistance. It focuses on the agency of Indigenous people and communities to enact the changes we want to see in our lives. This is a story which honors the gifts our ancestors have passed on to us and calls on us to uphold the obligations we have to the lands, animals, ancestors, and to one another. Yet this is also a story that tells the hard truths about the ways we have been swept up by the allure of state-delineated forms of recognition. It's a story in which we have at times unknowingly become actors in our own oppression. The coercion and control that the state has over our lives limit both the mechanisms through which we seek freedom and, most depressingly, the ways we imagine our own freedom. The story Glen tells about recognition politics destroys the happy vision of walking arm in arm for reconciliation between Indigenous peoples in Canada, as it exposes the ways this hopeful vision works to obscure and deny the underlying violence and coercion that structures settler colonialism. Indeed, the story this book tells is one in which colonialism, as others have already said, is not a far-off event that happened in the past, but an ongoing process that's taking place through these very mechanisms of reconciliation we've come to yearn for. Having exposed the truths of this coercive and abusive relationship, we are better equipped to strategize our freedom. And while political theory is not always accessible to the average Indigenous activist, and some of these pages might be hard to get through for some, one of the strengths of the book, I think, is that it is very much grounded in the types of struggles we're all familiar with: blockades, land claims, Supreme Court cases, idle no more. And Glen skillfully brings these struggles into conversation with political theory in ways that are specific to our current colonial context. And one of the useful aspects of this, I think, is the careful way the book maps the technicalities and mechanisms through which state-delineated processes have come to define our rights and freedoms. So, for example, tracing the Dene Nation's shift from self-determination movements to anti-pipeline mobilization to negotiated land claim settlements, we can see how potentially disruptive political actions are neutralized as the state creates structurally circumscribed forms of recognition and accommodation. Building on the work of Fanon, Coulthard explains that rather than providing a source of freedom for the colonized, state recognition, as stated on page 17, is the very field of power through which colonial relations are produced and maintained. We have not only come to buy into these limited forms of recognition, but have come to promote them, fight for them, and fight each other for them. Losing touch with the place-based foundations of what Glen calls grounded normativity, this account allows us to see how we come to define ourselves according to the terms set out by the Canadian state, rather than those of our ancestral and territorial teachings. So I see this book as a powerful tool to be used as we navigate our decisions about how and to what extent we engage with state actors and state systems at various scales. Because, as Glen himself admits in the book, settler colonialism necessitates that we continue to engage with the state's legal and political systems. So while Redskin White Mass usefully illustrates how struggles informed by land have been morphed into struggles for land, similar dynamics are at play in our struggles over control of our education, the care of our children, and trying to stop various kinds of violence. Glen provides useful insights into the transitional justice mechanisms such as state apologies, commissions of inquiry, and truth and reconciliation commissions, forms of justice we often see as a step forward in moving on after previously enacted atrocities, illuminating the sneaky ways in which they serve to situate the harms of settler colonialism in the past. In this process, and I quote here from page 127, Indigenous subjects are the primary objects of repair, not the colonial relationship. And I would add that such reconciliation politics not only serve to draw temporal limits around colonial harms, as situating them in the past, but also reinforce the spatial delineations that comprise Canada. Reconciliation narratives and processes unify Indigenous people across the nation of Canada, further naturalizing the erasure of Indigenous spatio-legal jurisdiction by treating us all as the same. One of the assimilative strategies of residential schools, as we know, was to remove Indigenous children from their families and communities, creating a distance between the students and their ancestral territories, both materially and psychically as well. As the state apologizes for taking us away from our reserves, it naturalizes the lines around these limited Aboriginal spaces, around reserves in the process, further erasing our deeper jurisdictional claims that together cover all of Turtle Island. Through the TRC and other examples, Glen demonstrates the ways in which reconciliation mechanisms mask the need for an actual shift in power, and I would add mute the underlying territorial relations which were severed through our displacement onto Indian reserves and into residential schools. As someone whose work is focused on ongoing and everyday realities of colonial violence, I found the discussion of resentment in the book to be incredibly refreshing, as anger is seen, and we've already talked about this, but I'll quote here from page 127, a sign of our critical consciousness, of our sense of justice and injustice, and of our awareness and unwillingness to reconcile ourselves with the structural and symbolic violence that is very present in our lives. And Jarrett talked about spaces in which this anger just needs to come out, but for me, gathering especially with a lot of women and girls in our communities, I also see a lot of sadness in those communities. So getting to anger is actually a positive thing. Yet, as Glen also discusses, we still have much work to do in addressing the gendered power dynamics within Indigenous communities which have shaped our critical consciousness. such that some forms of violence have not been treated as unjust at all, but are normalized and continue to be normalized within our own communities. In defining and promoting this critical consciousness, then it's worth asking ourselves, what issues do we get righteously angry about? And whose struggles do we rise up to defend collectively? This points to the fact that there is a recognition politics at play within Indigenous communities as well, ones that at their best account for all of our relations, and at their worst replicate the power structures that have been introduced by colonialism. And so here is where, when we gather in celebration, I didn't mention, we also sometimes critique one another, or my aunties might say correct one another. So I just want to focus a bit here on, again, as Rita did and others, the gender analysis deployed through the book. So throughout the book, Glen clearly asserts that strategies for authentic decolonization must directly confront more than economic relations, but must account for the ways in which capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy interact with each other. Yet at times I was confused about how this interlocking analysis matched up with his theorizations of violence. So, for example, one of the guiding questions in the book, stated on page 15, asks, what are we to make of contexts where state violence no longer constitutes the regulative norm governing the processes of colonial dispossession, as appears to be the case in ostensibly tolerant multinational liberal settler polities such as Canada? Further, Tyagi Alfred is quoted as saying that oppression has become increasingly invisible. It is no longer constituted in conventional terms of military occupation, onerous taxation burdens, blatant land theft, etc., but rather through a fluid confluence of politics, economics, psychology, and culture. It would appear in these definitions that state violence does not include the continued interpersonal violence perpetrated against Indigenous women and girls, nor the violence of Canadian legal processes themselves, a system which disproportionately criminalizes Indigenous women and is inherently incapable of or uninterested in ending violence against us. Nor does state violence appear to include the erasure of Two-Spirit people through the Indian Act categorizations, which are based on a gender binary, as well as other legal mechanisms and social norms. So the genealogies of violence in Coulthard and Alfred's definitions in these places appear to emerge, I would say, within masculinist frameworks, despite the ongoing calls for gender justice as integral to decolonial politics. And I would suggest that if the work of Indigenous feminist theorists were used to structure the central definitions of violence here, we might instead see that violent dispossession is still taking place. The invasion of Indigenous women's bodies, the theft of our children and locking us up in prisons, our homes and bodies are as much spaces of political occupation and conquest as are our lands and territories. And Glen's commitment to addressing gender inequities is also clear in the concluding section, in which he calls on Indigenous men to stop conducting themselves in ways that devalue women, both in overt and subtle ways in our daily relationships and in practices of cultural resurgence. And he also recognizes that any progress in the largely male-dominated world of formal negotiations is owed to the work of activists practicing their obligations to the land and to each other within diverse networks of struggle. And although not explicitly stated in the book, I would suggest this calls for a reconceptualization of spaces of resurgence, as they are themselves often deeply gendered. So much of the work of Indigenous women in the revitalization and maintenance of Indigenous sociocultural practices, just keeping us and our cultural knowledge alive through the generations, occurs not in the public sphere, but at the more intimate scales of our homes and families. Truly decolonizing gender relations and both the structural and symbolic violence which maintains them requires recognizing that Indigenous resurgence unfolds precisely within these intimate networks. The book also urges us to block economic exploitation of our people and homelands, while constructing alternatives to capitalism through turning increasingly to practices informed by our land-based obligations. Indigenous feminist theorists such as Andrea Smith have demonstrated that colonialism is not just about the imposition of capitalist modes of production, but is also about destroying alternatives to heteropatriarchy, as the hierarchies which structure capitalism are inherently heteropatriarchal. Thus, although I do commend Glen's call to form networks of solidarity across a diversity of struggles, including with the LGBTQ Two-Spirit groups, a decolonial Indigenous gender analysis, I might suggest, might frame the argument slightly differently. Revitalizing the roles of Two-Spirit people is indeed integral to confronting Western gender binaries and the stigmatization of Indigenous sexuality, which are necessary for the resurgence of diverse expressions of Indigenous modes of life. Thus, the revitalization of Indigenous paradigms of gender for women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people, as well as for men and boys, must be central to Indigenous resurgence efforts themselves, not only a movement with which to form networks of solidarity. Truly orienting ourselves toward Indigenous roles and responsibilities emerging from our territorial relations also requires embracing diverse and culturally specific gender roles. The responsibilities of Kwagilth men might be different from those of Dene men and different again from Lekwungen men, as determined by gendered cultural frameworks that truly emerge within the grounded normativity that Glen calls for. So taken together, I think Indigenous activists will find the analytics in this book instrumental as we navigate the multiple fronts on which we attempt to reorient ourselves toward Indigenous modes of being while turning away from the dehumanizing path of colonialism. In my own work on law and violence, this book reinforces the need for alternatives to state models of justice. We can see how the Canadian government repeatedly addresses the issue of missing and murdered women by portraying Indigenous women as inherently vulnerable subjects in need of healing or protecting, while reifying the power of the state as our saviors. Even those who reject recognition politics when it comes to self-determination or issues of land and resources sometimes still ask Indigenous women to reconcile ourselves to state-delineated forms of justice, as we, for example, call on Harper to initiate a national inquiry as missing and murdered women as the end solution to violence against us. Given these tensions, I believe we must all consider the differing levels of urgency which inform our decisions about how and when to turn to state systems in formulating our political strategies. Because although we might agree with the rejection of recognition politics in the book, the lives of many Indigenous people remain bound up in state systems, both ideologically and material, such that they cannot simply turn away from them. Today, right now, we know that 40% of women in federal prisons are Indigenous, 40%. And more than 50% of kids in care in BC are Indigenous. And we have, I think, a responsibility not to form an either-or politics which pits recognition against resurgence, but instead acknowledges that we can strategically navigate such systems with the renewed understanding that this book brings. As Nuu-chah-nulth activist, scholar, and warrior Chawinnis has said, coastal law demands that every woman has a home and everyone gets to eat. Until those obligations are fulfilled, we're not doing enough to respect the basic laws of this land. So if we really truly turn inward, what would happen if we were to mobilize to build every coastal woman a home? How would this impact the violence that we're now turning to the state for answers to? Because although resurgence can burst into the scene when movements like Idle No More take hold, resurgence also unfolds in the slow, intimate, everyday spaces in which we live our lives. It's in how we rejuvenate the camas harvest, how we raise and honor our children, how we respect and learn from our elders. And as Glen points out, resurgent efforts are as relevant in urban contexts as in rural areas, and we must be careful not to replicate the divisions that contribute to this divide between rural and urban spaces. Resurgence is indeed alive in this very space here of having me, a Kwagilth woman, take the floor to honor the network of relations in which my own emancipation is bound up in that of our Dene relative here. Because we don't need to just look back to find the networks of Indigenous law to which we are accountable. We need to look beneath the colonial geographies that have come to dominate our worldviews. Beneath this university, beneath the concrete streets of the city of Vancouver, beneath and before these colonial-scapes were imagined and then constructed, the territories of the Coast Salish are still alive with honor. Gathering together here, we enact our laws in honor of the ancestors of this land and our own, embodying our obligations in diverse ways. And this, I think, is one of the most powerful teachings that we can glean from the story told in Red Skin, White Mass. Indigenous resurgence is not ahead or out there. It's here on this land, in our bodies and relationships, and we're the ones who can claim it as such. Thank you.
thank you. That was very humbling. I'm really kind of at a loss for words right now. That was incredibly kind and thoughtful. I want to start by also thanking the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, where I've been living here for the last 8 years, or 7 years. All of you, when we were thinking about, or when Am and I were thinking about who to assemble for this, you were all my first choices because I've learned so much from you. I knew that you wouldn't hold back on any punches, and that it would force me to reflect more deeply on the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years. I also want to thank my mom, who's here, Christine, and Amanda, my partner. The grounding that the book has in what I think to be Dene thought and politics, and it's through that lens that I come to analyze the work of thinkers like Marx and Fanon and so on, is only available to me because of the way that my mom raised me. So I just want to acknowledge that and say merci. It's also, I should acknowledge the other half of that story, and that's my father, Richard, who passed away a couple of years ago, but it's his birthday today, so I want to acknowledge that too. So I'm going to just jump right into this. Oh, I would also like to say thanks to Daniel, who has also been a great colleague, to Dory, Nathan, and Cheryl, who I've also learned a lot from, and I noticed that Laura and Barbara are here too, so acknowledgements, recognition. My grad students, many of whom are here. I see a number of undergrad students, and again, like I'm a work in progress, and all of the conversations that I've had with these interlocutors have shaped my perspectives today, so I want to acknowledge that as well. I'm going to start with responding to Sarah's, because in Sarah's correcting of me, I can't help but just straight up concede and agree. I was, in terms of the way that this book, the book kind of unfolded pretty much from introduction to conclusion. And so when I was thinking about the core kind of, or the role that recognition plays in reproducing colonial relations of power, that work started about 10 years ago, 2007. And then as I moved more into chapters where I was looking at gendered violence in the era of constitutional negotiations in the 1980s, and then in the conclusion where I started to think about it more explicitly in contemporary movements, such as those that emerge in the present against murdered and missing Aboriginal women and girls, I just started to not believe my own story at like the way that I told it out at the beginning. So I really kind of tried to depict what a good friend of mine and comrade, Rob Nichols, has challenged me on, is this move from hard power to soft power. And I think that just conceptually is a way to think about our present circumstances, but perhaps it's to, in doing the conceptual work of separating it into clarifying it, it actually obscures exactly what you were talking about. That these things are always simultaneously being played out in our lives, although it may be differentially distributed in accordance to questions of gender and race and age and all these sorts of issues. So I just have to concede on that point. For Jarrett's concern about when anger goes sideways, I think that's I try and address that, but maybe not sufficiently, because I'm not sure how to do so. So that chapter really looks at this turn towards reconciliation, and the language of forgiveness as being this definitionally, this demand on Indigenous peoples, this pathologization of Indigenous peoples who have kind of become so wounded that we can't get over the past. It's not talking about a present structure of injustice and violence, it's talking about the past, and that's why the language of legacy is so important in this, because legacy isn't something that you're responding to in the present. Dispossession, theft, violence, imprisonment. Legacy is something that has hung on you. Even when the present is now claimed to be one of justice, we have the legacy of these skeletons in Canada's closet. In such a case, I say that to be resentful, to have a very bitter anger towards being treated unfairly, which is the definition of resentment, is not necessarily a passive force, but one that is actually demonstrating that something's wrong, or at least potentially demonstrating that something's wrong. It can entirely consume us, though. It can cause us to destroy ourselves. But even in such cases, I would want to suggest that we look at its root causes. So I would like to think of this book as an expression of radical political theory gesturing to some certain actions that might address some of the questions. And by radical, I simply mean in its traditional sense that we attack these issues at the root. So if we want to attack the destructive forces of anger and resentment that result in lateral violence, that result in self-destroying sort of activities and addictions, then it's not Indigenous peoples as victims, as being so incredibly damaged that we ought to do that. We have to uproot and blow to smithereens, in Fanonian words, the social relations that produce such conditions. So even when they are manifest in those dangerous forms, I still would want to address it at the root. That being said, the book is also largely for white people who don't like it. It's often because they feel like they're being attacked. But if I attack, I would say that I have a sustained attack on the way that Indigenous peoples have taken on these colonial forms of life and have distributed those violence amongst ourselves. So I'm equally as hard on us. And so this is not to say that we can just blame the structure. We have to also work on decolonizing ourselves in order to live a better way. Turning away as a matter of privilege, both Sarah and Rita had hinted at this. And I think I kind of flip-flop on this one. I think it definitely can be understood as a matter of, or as a privileged standpoint. But I'm also kind of, throughout the book, I make a number of gestures that I'm not saying that as Indigenous peoples we ought to vacate the field of recognition politics entirely. And precisely because it would be so incredibly arrogant of me as a professor, as a writer, to say so. That being said, the turn away that I was drawing off in the gender chapter owed two really core insights in my critique of that approach, which the Native Women's Association of Canada embodied, and they come from both Sarah and Trish Montour, who the late and great Mohawk legal scholar. And what they demand of us in our analysis, in our intersectional analysis, I think, so the ways in which these various configurations of power intersect to produce the effect that we're analyzing, which for me, in this case, is a structure of domination premised on violent land theft, is they throw the state in there again. The state kind of left our analysis I think, within radical traditions, not necessarily obviously with anarchists, but since the 1960s, kind of radical feminism, the state became like an appeal to legal structure that was presumed to be able to produce emancipatory effects or gender justice. And I think that Trish and Sarah's and Andy's work really challenge us to think of the state as a white man. And when you're appealing to the white man for recognition, the likelihood of that being a long-term justice strategy just starts to fade away. And so it's also speculating that like these strategic engagements with the state have to be done with a level of critical self-reflectivity in the immediate, but we should also be dreaming beyond it. Which leads me to a final sort of thoughts that I've been having, which may be controversial, is that this whole critique of recognition and mutuality and equality between peoples, I think, has to provide us as Indigenous peoples with some skepticism towards the kind of sacrosanct or like sacred almost position that we've upheld with respect to nation-to-nation relationships. Nation-to-nation relationships, treaty relationships, were often formed historically in contexts that are quite different than they are now. They were formed in histories where the power relations between Indigenous peoples and the state were more mutual. They were more interdependent. And in such a context, the nation-to-nation relationship could have solved and served in the purposes of peaceful coexistence. Now we've been entirely consumed through settler colonialism by the partner that we're supposed to be traveling along the river with, who ideally they wouldn't have veered into our path, but now have polluted the entire river and are destroying the riverbanks. And under such condition, I don't think we can recognize that partner as legitimate. There is no moral equivalency between the colonized and the colonizer. There is no legitimacy to the state's claim to these territories. There is no legitimacy to to recognize the legitimacy and of the capitalist mode of production. So this, I think, necessitates that we start to theorize and strategize a little bit better, where we're not looking to either gain recognition or give recognition to this ship on this parallel path. But like I said in Edmonton, our decolonization strategies must be aimed at sinking that ship. So it's no more parallel paths. It's no more equality, if you want the liberals up in arms. It's decolonization means sinking that fucking ship.
All right. So we have about 15 minutes before we start selling books and chatting and receptioning. So we have at least one. How many mics do we have? Okay, we have 2 microphones that will be made available to folks. Oh, lights. Excellent. There are a lot more of you out there than I thought. Hi. All right, so we have about 15 minutes, then we'll have some closing remarks and go on. So who would like to ask a question? Or one thing I do want to say, because we have a lot of people here, do try to keep the questions condensed so we can get as many as possible. And one question, not one of these multiple questions masquerading as one. So we have a hand up here in the corner.
Hi, I'm Raven John from Emily Carr. I was wondering what are some modes of decolonization and, I guess, dealing in general do you operate in when it comes to dealing with the resentment?
In the book, I look at resentment as an expression of moral protest against a harm that's ongoing. So I look at examples throughout the 80s where reconciliation emerged as a discourse after the state saw this, what they pathologized as an overboiling of resentment and anger, particularly among youth in indigenous nations, which was resulting in increased military or militancy, far more direct actions, and then also a potential threat of violence. So you look at all the direct actions in the 80s, whether it's from the Lubicron up to Oka. The state was really looking at this as a problem because two things were happening in Canada. One, the economy was being disrupted through these land-based direct actions, and second, it was losing control over its own monopoly on the use of political violence, and that became demonstrated at Oka. So instead of pathologizing that, I was looking at this being a really important movement that wasn't necessarily premised towards recognition, but was about Indigenous peoples putting their bodies on the lines, reattaching and enacting those relationships with land through mobilization and action. So, but it gets characterized as something that needs to be fixed, and I thought that the whole language of reconciliation, after it emerged explicitly after Oka, needs to rethink that. I think that was empowering and important movements. On a personal level, it's more tricky. Like writing that chapter was like pulling teeth. For 2 years, I wrote that chapter because it was essentially an exploration of my own anger issues and why I was so grumpy all the time. And then it essentially turned out, I was like, oh, it's because of colonialism that you're so grumpy all the time. So when people are standoffish with me in the hall or the classroom, it's because of colonialism.
We have a hand down here.
Question for Glen. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the work of Val Napoleon and Hadley Friedland, and what you think of it, if it's an example of the kind of turning away from the state that you envision.
Yeah, Val's a good friend of mine. We were doing our graduate work at UVic at the same time, and I've learned an incredible lot from her. And yes, I think it's exactly the type of resurgence that I'm talking about within the field of law. So a lot of legal, like prior to John Burroughs and Val's kind of interventions, and Sarah's now, a lot of kind of Indigenous legal theory was a politics of recognition, trying to figure out how Indigenous peoples fit within the constitutional order and how to better rejig that in order to better accommodate Indigenous languages and practices of political thought and legalities. And then there was this explicit turn, which I think that Val is really a paradigmatic expression of, where it's like, well, maybe we've got that approach wrong. Like, what would it mean to just start enacting and rebuilding our own legal traditions on our own terms, and kind of set aside the question of whether those legal orders could be recognized and accommodated by Canada? And I think that that's the right move.
Do we have any others? Oh, we have one over here.
Hi. My question is, so I'm sitting here listening to lots of super amazing thinking, and I am wondering if someone on the panel could expand on where this thinking and analysis interfaces with action in people's day-to-day lives and politics.
Well, in my work, I've had the privilege of working with people at a community level who are doing work around violence. So there's a lot of common understanding that if you call the police, sometimes you know that you need to get an offender out of your home, but other times you know that the cops might take your kids away, you might yourself get arrested, or they might never come, or there's many reasons why turning to the state for responding to violence is not commonly done in our communities. And so, although it's not visible outside the community context, there are a lot of ways that communities are turning to each other to look for responses to violence. So whether that's creating a safe house at an elder's home, whether that's creating community response teams, or just working slowly over change norms to prevent violence from happening in the first place. And that those are, what I have been saying is that those are enactments of Indigenous law. Those are creating new legal agreements with one another as to how we're going to treat each other at a local level, which is at the level at which Indigenous knowledge and legal practices have always happened. It's not one for Canada, right? So for me, that's one example just when it comes to violence and that's what I was talking about. Sometimes there's an urgency. You need to do something now and your neighbor's not home. Well, is it the best thing to call the police? Maybe sometimes people do, but lots of times they don't. And that there's other ways that people are looking at Indigenous ways of revitalizing relationships where violence won't happen instead.
So we had a hand here. Yeah.
Hi, I would like to first of all say thank you to all of you for your presentations this evening. And as someone who has survived two armed resistance at Oka and at Gustafson Lake, I would like to say that I really like your answer of righteous resentment. I agree with shooting the ship and sinking it or doing whatever it is to get rid of the damn ship anyway. But my question is around your concept of grounding normativity. I'm wondering if I haven't read the book yet. I've had it for a few weeks, like when it first came out, but I just haven't had a chance to read it yet. But just listening to all of you, I'm wondering if that concept is regional to us, to each of us, right? And in that, in terms of our nations, like when you're talking about how the context from before, when the treaties were made, when the settlers first came, there was more mutuality. And I've got involved in a discussion around ceremonies this summer when someone filmed the Sundance for APTN, and we were talking about whether, the rightness or wrongness of that. And the Sundance chief came back with a really interesting answer around how before the settlers came in pre-contact, our ceremonies were not secret. So I think it's really interesting to look at how we did things prior to being caught up in the colonial binaries. So I'm wondering, is grounding normativity regional? Thank you.
Yeah, the grounded normativity idea came to me after actually starting to in the work that I do up north and the kind of educational programming that I'm involved in, which is land-based and works with elders a lot through Dechinta, where we're starting to practice these activities. So if colonialism is a violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples and tearing us from the land, and if we think of the land not as a material relationship, but as one that is a reciprocal relationship between things that guides our ethical kind of understandings of obligation and so on, grounded normativity is a play on words. It's like a normative framework, so how we think about critically and how we ought to conduct our lives, that is literally of the ground. It is of place. It is very regional. And this is the contrast with other forms of normativity that attempt to ridiculously think that we could come to some abstract principles that are outside of social relations and then best approximate our practices and institutions to those abstract principles. It's a flip. It is through these practices and these engaging in these practices and relationships that we begin to see the world critically and understand what's wrong with it and what we ought to do to fix it. So in one sense, it's going to always be place-based, and then we start to understand the obligations that we have to the world in a much wider understanding based on those places and those relationships that we practice. This puts some demands on us, and it puts some demands on us as Indigenous peoples to remain connected to those practices that are associated with certain places and lands and traditions and bodies of knowledge and so on. That's why I don't think we can entirely separate ourselves from that, or the knowledge and the ethics and so on will eventually whittle away or transform. But I worry about those transformations not necessarily being positive ones, but perhaps ones that we will regret and feel as a loss.
So we have time for a couple more questions. We have one here, and then we have another. We can do three. So one here, and then two over here.
Congratulations, Glen, and thank you very much to everyone on the panel. It's just an incredible conversation. I wanted to ask you about grounded normativity in the urban sense. Here in the downtown east side, we're here at SFU Woodwards. There's a disproportionate representation of Aboriginal people in the downtown east side. Gentrification, displacements, and capital accumulation by dispossession happens here as well. And so I just wanted to hear some thoughts from you about your book in the context of urban Aboriginals and what urban Aboriginals face in a community like the downtown east side, how grounded normativity factors into that, and what your sort of theory of change around a better situation for urban Aboriginals might look in that context.
I kind of end with some ramblings on urban sovereignty issues, and it's part of a much broader project that I'm working on now, which is going to be like a critique of settler political economy. It's going to be the Indigenous Peoples Marx's Capital, Volume 1. But I look at what I try and do in that, and this is very cursory, I just look at structural and effective similarities between dispossession as we think of it in relationship to land through the lens of primitive accumulation, and dispossession and displacement now internalized within cities through processes of violent gentrification. And I think that looking at it in this bigger historical process makes it less easy for us as urban Indians or Indians associated with more attachment to a land base, whether it be a reserve or traditional territories, to think of our experiences as different in kind. So over I Don't Know More, you saw this kind of emerge often as like, well, our experiences are different than yours. And then it was foreclosing the possibility of effective networking and solidarity and struggle. And I just started to think that that's not necessarily the case. Cities are Indigenous land too. They're sovereign spaces, or ought to be treated as sovereign spaces according to whose territories that we're on. And the experience of dispossession and displacement in places like the downtown east side, of which this monstrosity of a building is contributing to, is experienced in a similarly violent in terms of its effect. So part of it is just to tell this story that shows these processes as congruent, as very similar, in order to bridge some of those gaps. How to go about fixing it, I haven't really figured out yet, but I know that one of the things that we can't do is make uncritical, ahistorical claims to the commons in our anti-gentrification efforts, because it's not necessarily common land in that sense, or common space. This space is still indigenous space. So when you make these common claims, whether it's in Woodwards or whatever, you serve the same, or you potentially serve the same erasure that exclusionary claims, as in the Lockean highest and best use discourse does. You're erasing indigenous sovereign presence and land rights, but now for kind of more quasi-socialist purposes, and not necessarily individualist, capitalist, private interest ones. So I just would want to insist, and this is some of the and some of the work that I've been doing off and on down here, is kind of to keep interjecting that insistence that there are layers of dispossession that are going on here and that have violent effects, and those have to be attended to in our anti-gentrification efforts. Or else we could replicate the very things we at least claim in words to find so abhorrent.
Glen, congratulations on the book, and thank you to the panelists. Wak Kuknalia Natamuk, Coast Salish, Kalmuk. I just want to acknowledge the territory of the Coast Salish. Shiri Pasternak, a geographer and activist who worked for many years with the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, wrote in a recent article, I think it's called Where Laws Meet, she sort of provides or suggests a definition for decolonizing law, and two of the elements there were recognition and repudiation. And she talks about recognition in the sense of recognizing indigenous legal orders, speaking, of course, in the context of where a colonial hegemonic legal order is conflicting with an indigenous legal order being asserted in the context of a blockade or something like that. And so I'm wondering, does that definition of decolonization, of decolonizing law or decolonizing space, does that provide something, or does that bring something to bear with how you're thinking about recognition in your book?
I would venture to guess so. Again, Shiri's a good friend of mine, and we've been thinking together for like 10, not quite 10 years, 7 years, 6 years. So probably. I haven't read it though, so sounds pretty rad, but so is she. So.
Okay, I think we're actually running short on time. So just as a final few words, any great book is measured not just by its author, but by its readers. And we've had the really great benefit of 4 very fine readers at the podium this evening. We also have the benefit of many fine readers in the audience. So it's been a really wonderful night. We're very, again, this is the best book launch I've ever been to. But it speaks to a real hunger for different kinds of answers, different kinds of understandings, different kinds of relationships, and not just, Glen has given us a lot to think about, but so too have this evening's speakers who've taken that up in meaningful, challenging, provocative, and beautiful ways. So thank you to all of you for your words. Thank you to Glen for your book and for your work. Thanks to all of you. I've been scanning the crowd, and I see so many familiar faces. I see First Nations Studies faculty and staff and students. I see community members. I see allies. I see friends. And I see future friends and allies and students and others. I want to thank very much everyone here who's made this possible. All the microphone holders who've made it possible for us to share our words. But there's much more happening this evening. Travel safely, read deeply, and let's thank Glen and the panelists again for a wonderful evening.